National Research Team, I'd really like to offer you a very warm welcome. So today marks the publication of our two project reports. The first is an extensive literature review documenting the impact of the pandemic on live performance in each of the G7 nations. And the second is a shorter policy report. It provides a comparative analysis of this research alongside 5 recommendations tailored for policymakers in the UK. So today we'll give you a top-level view of the key lessons learned, and we'll hear from our headline speaker, Stephanie Fraser, Baroness Fraser of Craigmaddie, who sits on the board of Creative Scotland and is also co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for dance. We'll then drill deeper into the best practice examples that underpin our recommendations before finishing with a Q&A. Now, a few words of housekeeping. The event is recorded. Please keep your cameras and microphones off and use the chat function for chatting and the Q&A function for questions throughout the presentations, which will take just over an hour. The chat will be monitored and questions will be directed to our team for responses during the Q&A. We would ask you to use the link in the chat or this QR code to respond to our 2-question evaluation survey before you leave. Now, we're joined today by members of our research team and a group of external speakers, so thank you all for sharing your viewpoints. Ready to answer your questions afterwards are additionally members of our team from Japan and Italy, and also members of our lived experience panel of creatives joining us from Canada, the USA and the UK. So the project started 12 months ago when a total of 14 researchers spread across the G7 nations set about producing reviews of the academic and grey literature on COVID impacts on live performance. Our research questions were guided by interviews with stakeholders in the UK, and here we wish to acknowledge the early advice of our lived experience panel members and representatives of our project partners, Freelancers Make Theatre Work, and Something to Aim For. We additionally spoke with representatives of Bectu, Equity, the Society of London Theatres, UK Theatre, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, as well as Arts Council England. And our international partners likewise engaged with key stakeholders in their respective live performance sectors. Once the research was completed, we developed our recommendations through an iterative process involving consultations with a larger number of stakeholders. Our overarching aim throughout this process was to identify actionable insights from our research that could help government bodies, funders and sector organisations in fostering resilience and addressing the inequities and structural problems exposed by the pandemic. Uniquely, the transnational scope of our project has made it possible for us to gain a sort of big picture view of the challenges and opportunities facing us. We've been able to identify broader trends, pinpoint what worked where and how, spot emerging threats and gaps in awareness, and also draw lessons from best practices, both domestically and within the G7 context. And I'll now highlight some headline findings. These contribute to ongoing dialogues regarding the role of culture, such as those ignited by the cuts to local government budgets and lobbying by the Campaign for the Arts, the Chancellor's spring budget announcements regarding a theatre tax relief, additional funding for the National Theatre and its Skills Academy, and also for devolved culture, and Labour's proposals for an arts strategy. So on policy, we found that the most widespread forms of policy response were economic. Successful responses were speedy, they were generous and underpinned by a granular understanding of the sector as an ecosystem. The best practice can be found in Germany, where support was rapid, plentiful, and informed by dialogue with sector leaders. Across the G7 nations, within the workforces, there were significant job and income losses, with freelancers most likely to fall through the cracks of support systems everywhere. But today, we'll draw your attention to the French social security system for artists, which prevented the worst impacts for freelancers in France. Organizations. We found, the additional thing about workforces is that everywhere the pandemic exacerbated existing structural disadvantages, affecting racialized artists, women or younger professionals, working class artists, parents, carers, and those living with long-term illnesses or disabilities. And the result was a real mental health tsunami, which was exacerbated in countries where governments questioned the viability of arts careers. Many artists and technicians found work outside the sector, leaving significant skills gaps, including in technical and middle management jobs. And now to organizations. Organizational survival critically hinged on government support. But in Canada and the UK, where eligibility criteria for funding were designed primarily for the subsidized sector, commercial organizations struggled to access this support. Clarity of communication regarding public health restrictions was key for organizations. And as the pandemic recedes across all G7 nations, we see attendance at live theatrical events has not returned to pre-pandemic levels, accelerating long-term trends. While a pivot to digital helped organizations maintain contact with audiences and reach some new and international audiences, as was notably the case for Japan, everywhere there was a snapback to in-person performance as soon as the restrictions eased. Organizations with existing investments in digital skills and infrastructure fared better than those without, but digital activity was not always easy to translate into earnings. So digital ended up not being a one-size-fits-all solution, even as it increased access for disabled and otherwise marginalized communities. Some people were left out. Finally, on communities, places, and cultural value, we found that across the G7, live performances really helped build morale during the depth of the crisis. Shared experiences fostered a sense of belonging and improved well-being for audiences and artists. Artists reoriented their activities towards socially engaged community theatre and placemaking. And the pandemic therefore birthed a new wave of discourse around the value of culture as a transformative social good. And this has fed proposals for new legislation supporting the arts in Canada and Germany. So I now hand over to Stephanie Fraser, who will share her insights with us and who will talk about the broader subject of cultural value. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Pascal, and I hope everybody can hear me. And I'm just like to say that I'm absolutely delighted to be with you all today. I have been asked to think about our reflections of the crisis and how we can use our experience and the research to support and enable better policy making. And because I am a member of the UK House of Lords, a board member of Creative Scotland, and co-chair of the APPG for Dance, I will be focusing on the UK. Life for the performing arts, as we all know, remains extremely challenging as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact all our lives in many different ways, economically, socially, and in terms of health and well-being. I see these challenges in my day job as Chief Executive at Cerebral, Palsy Scotland, because in healthcare, the NHS is still trying to catch up. We are seeing lengthy waiting lists for appointments, training budgets constrained, staff morale is low, and vacancies are at a record high. Last week, I was giving evidence to the Scottish COVID inquiry regarding the experience of people with cerebral palsy, and it's startling to think that even though I was talking about events that happened 4 years ago, the effects of that time, the impact of the restrictions, the substantial rise in anxiety levels and fear of being in crowded spaces is still having a significant impact and an impact on audience behaviours today. Shortly after joining the House of Lords, I became a member of the COVID-19 committee. This was a special time-limited committee, and our remit was to consider the longer-term implications of the pandemic, which was always going to be a challenging task. Despite our best efforts to focus on the long term, it was almost impossible for us and our witnesses to disentangle the ever-changing reality of living through a global pandemic from its potential longer-term consequences. And I believe this remains a challenge for us today, as it is almost impossible to fully unravel the impact of the pandemic from other changes driven by technology, demography, climate change, and shifting global powers. The overriding finding of the committee was the need to improve resilience and preparedness for a volatile and uncertain future. This is something the performing arts instinctively know and understand, as the ability of the sector to adapt and problem solve is, I believe, one of its greatest strengths. We must not shy away from the fact that in future we will experience climate disasters, pandemics, and other catastrophes that will be far worse than the COVID-19 pandemic. And therefore, all of us must learn lessons to ensure the performing arts are prepared, which is why today's event and the research of the British Academy is so extremely important. The pandemic has shown that our current understanding of resilience and preparedness is not fit for purpose, and this must change. But governments cannot act in isolation. The report of the COVID committee said resilience comes in large part from the capacity and capability of non-government actors, from individuals and communities to businesses and charities, to take action and mobilise. The government's role is to enable, support, and coordinate. In January last year, the Chancellor set out his 5 key growth areas in his long-term vision for the economy, and quite rightly, in my view, the creative industries was one of these sectors. At this time, I became a member of the Communications and Digital Committee, whose report, At Risk Our Creative Future, published in January 2023, highlighted the economic potential of the creative industries in the UK, but warned that our global success was in danger of being taken for granted. The government responded with their creative sector vision, billed as a joint plan to drive growth, build talent, and develop skills. And certainly the government has the convening power to bring organisations, sectors together. But representatives from across all of the performing arts should be making it as easy as possible for government to know what needs to be done, to understand the full implications of their actions, while also organising ourselves as a sector to recognise and take advantage of opportunities as they arise. I welcome government funding being allocated throughout the UK, including in the devolved administrations through the Levelling Up Fund, and I welcome the tax measures and investments announced in the budget. But local arts funding remains in crisis, and I am concerned to note the lack of support for arts education and the decline in arts enrolment at GCSE and A-level. Where is the training pipeline for the future of the performing arts if we do not ensure a quality arts education is available for every child and young person? The government has a national plan for music in education, but not at present for the rest of the performing arts. And one of my, maybe many frustrations is that while the music industry, and to an extent the film, television and screen industries, seem to be able to coordinate and grab the attention of policymakers, the rest of the performing arts are too often left too far behind. Which brings me on to the subject of APPGs, or all-party parliamentary groups. These can be effective forums to discuss and share concerns with parliamentarians from both houses and from across all political parties. Run well, they can stimulate questions and debates. However, the challenge is to make such groups meaningful in order to achieve action and to stand out from the crowd. A quick check this weekend confirmed there are hundreds of such groups. And as of the end of this week, the rules are changing in order to qualify as an APPG. Each group must have four officers and at least 20 members from either house. And from the next parliament, members cannot join more than 6 APPGs. So competition for members' attention will be steep. Currently, the APPG for dance does not meet the criteria. I don't know about the groups for opera, theatre, performing arts education and training, and all of the other groups that could cover issues for the performing arts. But this is my point. Together we stand, divided we fall. And I would welcome and heartily support moves to establish a more visible collective voice for the performing arts sector. Today's event agenda throws up some issues that are very close to my heart, that I haven't had time to touch on, but which I will look forward to hearing about later. Disability artists and inclusion, the role of digital in particular. And I am also looking forward to hearing the perspectives from international partners and from funding bodies. The performing arts have a great story to tell. The economic stats are good, and it's important that we keep reminding the Treasury of these, as this is the evidence on how performing, and also the evidence of how performing arts support better physical and mental health and well-being. And it's important that we talk to the Department of Health about these. But I believe more importantly, we need support and recognition because of the innate value of the performing arts in society. And so I will end with the perhaps apocryphal story of when Churchill was asked to cut funding to the arts in order to support the war effort in World War II. He responded, "Then what would we be fighting for?" Even if he didn't say this, he is recorded as saying in 1938, and I quote, "The arts are essential to any complete national life. The state owes it to itself to sustain and encourage them." In that case, we, the representatives and supporters of the performing arts, must ensure we remain as united and as resilient as we can in order to hold the state to account for this. I look forward to working with you all and to the rest of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for those reflections. We're really pleased that you were able to be here today to introduce the recommendations, which is the next section of our event today. We start with our first recommendation, which centres on the need for a resilience strategy for live performance. And the aim here is to establish channels for clear and consistent communication, for effective coordination of emergency funding, and an understanding of what is best practice for incorporating culture into crisis response and recovery plans. Across the G7, the sector was unprepared for the pandemic. However, in some countries, existing structures or a willingness perhaps to commit significant financial investment, as in Germany, did support greater resilience. Firstly, we see a need for government to work with arts councils or development agencies to establish a power to convene a truly representative emergency working group. There's also a need to examine and learn from devolved initiatives that supported the creative workforce differently and which integrated arts and culture quite directly into crisis response planning. And we noted examples of this within both some of the UK's devolved nations and in Germany. Arts funders and trade associations with unions should ensure that those they support are planning strategically for future crises of all kinds. And this means developing clear sector-specific guidance to support future emergency closures. It means agreeing a framework for simplified access to emergency funding for smaller organisations and individuals, and that includes freelance creatives. and it means supporting organisations with practical plans for climate crisis resilience now. As you'll hear in a few minutes from one of our international colleagues, such planning is really urgent as climate change is already affecting the sector in parts of the G7. To respond to these recommendations, I'm now going to hand you over to two members of our international research teams. First, to speak on the topic of climate crisis resilience will be Professor Barbara Fuchs of UCLA in the USA. Barbara.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Karen. So from our interviews and review of the specialized press, US theater companies seem woefully unprepared for the climate crisis. Most of the thinking has instead been about how theater can help advocate for climate action or how companies' operations might be made more sustainable. Instead, theaters must face up to the fact that the climate crisis is here and impacting their work. Already in this moment, we need adaptation as well as advocacy. In summer 2022, Michael Paulson, who covers theater for the New York Times, wrote about raging wildfires in California impeding the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in the next state to the north, and how climate change was impacting the beloved tradition of summer outdoor performance. By summer 2023, he was writing about how smoke from massive wildfires in Canada forced Broadway theaters in New York City, some 600 kilometers away, to cancel performances. The saving grace was that some of those theaters had installed air filtration systems during COVID that were making it possible, barely, for the show to go on, assuming patrons were willing to brave the air outside to get there. In the past year, I have personally had the experience of canceled performances due to floods in Los Angeles and in New York. Unfortunately, none of those companies could call on alternate forms of delivery to salvage the performances. Our strong recommendation is that theaters confront the fact that the climate catastrophe will lead to canceled performances and other disruptions to business as usual. Our report stresses that companies must build climate resilience and decarbonization into their current organizational models and future goals. The time to prepare is now, whether by making contingency plans or purchasing a generator. Preparation also involves recognizing what we learned from the pandemic. Digital delivery systems and other forms of outreach offer a crucial lifeline, one that would allow theaters to switch modes rather than entirely cancel performances. In addition to assisting in the event of a new health emergency, virtual theater can also preserve vital access to culture and protect companies' livelihoods amid the climate catastrophe. I now hand over to Professor Heidi Lütke at Goethe University in Frankfurt, who will tell us about the best practice example of Hesse, where the pandemic has led to a new approach to making the sector more resilient.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. The funding landscape in Hesse, a state in Midwest Germany, distinguishes itself from other federal states. A noteworthy development in this regard emerged with the implementation of new guidelines in 2023. These guidelines, developed against the background of the lessons learned during the pandemic, signify a strategic effort to simplify the process of accessing funding from the federal state, reflecting a commitment to fostering a more supportive financial environment for various initiatives and endeavors. The Hessian Ministry of Science and the Arts is thus taking up suggestions from the participation process for the Masterplan Kultur. With immediate effect, the new cultural funding guidelines simplify the application process, funding conditions, and verification procedures, especially for grants of up to 10,000 euros. The initial budget of 6.7 million euros was allocated in the 2023-24 fiscal year. The development of the Masterplan Kultur began with Kulturatlas, a comprehensive survey of Hessian cultural landscapes published in 2018. This masterplan is the result of an extensive participatory process which, for the first time, jointly considered the consequences of the pandemic and current cultural policy issues. The process consisted of online questionnaires, workshops, and expert rounds, which ultimately identified key themes. What emerged was a 60-page-long mission statement, which delineates ways in which Hesse can support, foster, and even newly create culture in the future. While it has in particular been pushed by the Green Party, crucially, the Christian Democratic Party and the Social Democratic Party were also key players in this process. The pandemic partially delayed and complicated the process, but acted as a driving force to tackle the problems. This master plan is the first cultural development plan of a German federal state that systematically addresses the pandemic's challenges and outlines solutions. Highlights and key areas of concern include schools of music, which will be supported stronger both by the communes and the Federal Association of Music Schools, a greater valorization of the work freelancers are doing, which is also to be reflected in adequate salaries, a greater support of artists in rural areas, and innovative ways to create performance events outdoors. Thank you.
We now move on to our second recommendation. It is that public funding should be directed towards research and analysis of the live performing arts sector as an ecosystem. Too much of the decision-making about the sector, we found, has suffered from sort of siloed information and a failure to understand how commercial and subsidized parts of the sector are interconnected across all 4 nations. As the ENO controversy has also shown, we need to have also a better understanding of art forms in relation to the wider ecosystem and places. Proper mapping of the ecosystem, such as we just heard happened in Hesse, has to involve sector stakeholders. It needs to include in-depth analysis of the workforce to understand working patterns and artistic life cycles, with attention to racial, gendered, socioeconomic, and geographical determinants. We also need to understand changing audience behaviors and attitudes across the nations and sectors, including in relation to digital. This research is essential to be able to develop funding structures that account for interdependencies between segments of the sector. It can also create the understanding needed to develop an art form strategy. On a more granular level, it can support organizations in rethinking their structures, processes, and programming in the face of challenging economic conditions and changing behaviors. Now, crucially, such ecosystems mapping can then provide the evidence base for support structures appropriate for intermittent freelance or portfolio creative workers during periods of partial or full unemployment caused by future crises, such as the French model that we will hear about next. So I therefore hand over to Dr. Caroline Demeyer, who can tell us some more about the Intermittent du Spectacle Social Security Support Scheme, which worked as a safety net for freelance artists in France. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Pascal. We would like to focus on the specific unemployment compensation scheme for performing art workers in France called Intermittent du Spectacle. This is a social insurance scheme created in 1936 that supports employment and mitigates work precarity. It consists in financial support for performing art workers based on the specificities of their employment. It enables artists, but also technicians, to be systematically considered as employees rather than freelancers. They are hired based on an employment contract where each employer pays a salary that includes social contributions for healthcare, pensions, and unemployment. This creates an effective social security net. It also enables workers to combine unemployment benefits and part-time contracts, securing stable overall incomes. To be eligible, performing art workers need to accumulate 507 hours of work per year, regardless of the number of contracts and employers. During the COVID-19 pandemics, employees who were recognized as intermittent du spectacle could receive a portion of their salary, even if they were not working or working for reduced hours. The 507 hours of work required to access the intermittent scheme were reduced, with 2 blank years in 2020 and 2021. In contrast with many other countries, we observed no massive dismissal, no massive contracts termination or retraining of performing art workers. Even though workers were concerned about the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on their organizations and on their industry, they were less worried about the future than they might have been without these safety nets. Yet our research suggests that working conditions and well-being at work deteriorated during this period. Current preoccupation revolve around two pivotal issues. So first, the reintegration of audiences into physical venues, complicated by shifts in audience behavior, such as the desire for outdoor activities. And second, the cultural sector grapples with the imperative of embracing ecological consideration, causing sustainable practices and eco-friendly initiatives. I now hand over to Neil Darlison, Director of Theatre Arts Council, England.
Hello. Thank you. I hope everybody can hear and see me.
You can.
Great, good. Okay. I work for one of the devolved arts councils in the UK, of which there are 4: England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And Arts Council England played a significant part during the pandemic in distributing the cultural recovery funds made available by the British government to many to all 4 devolved arts councils, as well as other industry bodies, including Historic England and the British Film Institute. It was a system that had to be quite quickly had to quite quickly find its way through the pandemic, and particularly the early stages. And what was interesting about establishing some early funds, the first one which was from the Arts Council, but then and then from the government, was quite quickly defining which organisations we thought would require funding, how we might measure that, how those organisations interrelate with each other, insofar as what were the commonalities between different performing arts organisations and non-performing arts organisations, and where the differences was. As we know from what we've heard so far, the pandemic quite quickly shined a light on a lot in our industry and indeed in our society that we were unaware of. I think particularly within the theatre organisations, we realised that depending on which percentage you think you listen to, a huge amount of our staff and our creators were freelance, and we needed to find a way in which those individuals and those with portfolio careers could benefit from funding. And so the Arts Council worked quite quickly with those other organisations in order to do that. Recent work that we have been doing in establishing a methodology in order for the organisations that we fund to become more sustainable has suggested that works much more strongly within art forms, within sectors, and within disciplines. And so in that respect, it's been really useful to note how quite quickly new working practices spread within particular cohorts, as opposed to having a major overarching plans and planning for a cultural sector, which in the UK is quite wide and quite diverse. Eisenhower famously said, planning is essential, plans are useless. And it will be difficult to know when the next crisis arrives quite which plan that we will have to enact in order to make sure that the cultural organisations that we all work with come through it. Be that climate, be that another pandemic, be that something as yet that we're unaware of. But what I think from the report that we've all read, that the regular discussions about this the overlapping Venn diagram of leadership between the art forms and the sectors will be particularly useful as we start to think about how we all make movements towards ensuring that the moves that we have to take normally quite quickly and at pace will be useful in terms of the arts councils of the UK responding to any kind of external threat. So thank you very much for that. I think I'm passing back to is it Pascal? Yes.
Thank you, Neil. It's back to me. We're playing ping pong with the.
Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you again. Thank you, Neil. So our next recommendation is around the area of skills gaps. And as we've heard, there were a number of gaps that were kind of exposed and exacerbated by the pandemic. The aim of our recommendation here is to enable organisations and individuals to respond effectively if and when a next crisis hits. So, as we have already heard, across the G7, the workforce suffered, and it suffered most wherever it was already structurally disadvantaged. And there is a risk of even further decreased diversity in a sector whose lack of diversity is already well recognised, I think. The pandemic resulted in moves by technical and administrative staff to sectors where they were able to secure better pay and working conditions. It also highlighted the imbalance of professional development opportunities available to freelance or contract workers. So in response, we're asking arts funders to coordinate and share the learning from skills and training audits within subsidised organisations, and to continue to support organisations in opening up their spaces and professional development opportunities to both local creatives and to freelancers. We suggest that trade associations and sector bodies need to work with higher and further education institutions to kind of co-produce new programmes of vocational training in performing arts that can link really securely to the skills required in the workplace. Initiatives such as the National Theatre's recently announced Skills Centre are most welcome, but it is important that organisations of all sizes can benefit from new programmes, and they may need administrative support to do so. We also need to establish best practice ways of transferring knowledge within and between organisations. To comment and respond here, I'm pleased to first pass you over to Lisa Cunningham, Director of Policy Research and Advocacy for the Society of London Theatre and UK Theatre. Lisa.
Thank you so much, Karen, and hello everybody. Thank you to Karen, Pascal, and the team for your work in this area. The caveat I need to give before making any sort of remarks is I've been in my roles just 6 months, and I'm new to the culture and arts sector. So I obviously didn't work here during the pandemic, but it's clear to me that, you know, it was a fundamental moment for the sector, as it was for many, of course, and for many individuals. And the lessons are still being learned, and your really valuable work has certainly provoked a lot of conversations within the Society of London Theatre and UK Theatre, which is the trade association for theatre, and is really, really valuable. So thank you very much. I just wanted to make a few points to contribute to the discussion, and one seems really, really broad, but I think it's really worth making, and I feel it to my bones. And that is that theatre is very, very unique and very, very special. Theatre and performing arts, and we learned that very much during COVID. It is an economic powerhouse. It delivers transformative social good up and down the country, and it's embedded in our communities. It has benefits for individuals in terms of well-being and a safe space to explore ideas. It has benefits for communities in terms of what a good community, a good high street looks like. And it has benefits for society in terms of what we say about ourselves and who we are. And I think it's really worth remembering that and celebrating that when we're thinking about lessons from situations such as COVID, or indeed anything else. So COVID dramatically change the sector. So sometimes when I'm engaging with politicians and other stakeholders, they ask me whether we've recovered from COVID, and I think that's slightly the wrong framing, because I think it has fundamentally changed, and some of the lessons that are drawn out in this report helps to kind of illustrate that. One of the broad things that it's taught the organisation I work for, and I hope our members too, is what a really good and high-performing trade association can do on behalf of its members and behalf of government when there's a problem, and to act as a conduit for conversation, for information, to facilitate peer support and peer conversation, and to basically prevent as much as possible panic and hold people together to allow a team effort and collaboration in response to a crisis or when something happens that requires that kind of sector-wide response. And I think that's a very, very, very valuable lesson. Very specifically, when it comes to skills, one of the things that COVID taught us is not to take our workforce for granted. There was a bit of a spell around this, the show must go on, and theatre being an extremely glamorous place to work. And I wonder sometimes whether our sector took that for granted in terms of its workforce without investing in it sufficiently and thinking about where we can grow our workforce from. And as we've heard from Karen, that some people left us during COVID and didn't return. And what does that mean for the future? Well, I think there's some really interesting kind of questions around the role of an effective trade association, working with government to support the management, the proactive management of talent pipelines. Baroness Fraser spoke very clearly and eloquently in her opening remarks about the role of cultural education in maintaining the start of talent pipelines, and we would agree with that wholeheartedly. And we would add that to maintain talent pipelines and to look after them, we need to be probably a bit more proactive, and that's something we're thinking about very much at Salt and UK Theatre. Some of our bigger members that have scale are doing that themselves, developing their own programmes of work. The announcement recently from government about a review of apprenticeships to make them more flexible, very, very beneficial and helpful for the type of work that you get around moving around with performances, that instead of employers that would help our sector. But fundamentally, there's probably questions that still to be asked and still to be answered around what it means to grow the skills and look after the skills that we need in order to maintain and build and look after our world-class performing arts. I'll hand back over to Pascal and Karen.
Hello, my name is Carolyn M.L. Forsyth, Executive Director and Joint CEO of Tallowa Theatre Company. As a leader of this cultural institution, I'm here to shed light on the profound challenges facing the culture sector in the aftermath of the pandemic. Our journey, our struggles, and our vision encapsulates the broader narrative of resilience and adaptation that defines this pivotal moment in history. Tallowa Theatre is a beacon of Black excellence in the UK, founded in 1986, has weathered storms, embraced triumphs, our purpose deeply rooted in championing Black excellence, nurturing talent, and telling passionate stories reflective of the Black experiences. It has never been more pertinent, yet the past few years has tested us in ways we could have never imagined. The pandemic impacted on our industry has been systemic, has been seismic, and the closure of venues, the cancellation of events, and the restrictions on gatherings have inflicted profound financial wounds, particularly for touring organisations like ours. For Tallowa, the stoppages of touring for 2 to 3 years meant not just a loss of revenue, but a loss of talent to other sectors and a loss of expertise to other industries. But amidst the challenge, there were glimmers of hope. Tallowa pivoted swiftly, harnessing the power of digital platforms to continue our mission. We engaged with audiences, we created, we innovated. However, the transition wasn't without its challenges. The digital divide exposed a glaring skills gap within our sector, a gap that threatened to exacerbate existing inequalities.
Thanks, Karen.
Jobs, financial instability and barriers to training have hit hardest those already on the fringes. Tallowa too felt the strain. The relentless pursuit of talent for administrative and backstage roles proved fruitless, leaving us grappling with diminished capacity and capability, i.e. 12 months with no fundraiser or 8 months with no comms or marketing manager, vital roles that put a strain on the team and leadership. As a small organisation, the impact of missing staff was keenly felt. My team was not furloughed. We worked for the entirety of the pandemic. And what we found was that the team experienced burnout and exhaustion. Staff turnover increased. Lest we forget, at the same time as the pandemic, the horrific last moments of George Floyd's life reverberated around the world. The trauma of that and COVID became intertwined and unseparate, and there was an inability to separate the two things. And it left my team reeling. 2020 asked more of my staff than could have ever been requested before or expected of anyone to provide. We cannot afford to stand idly by as the very essence of our cultural heritage hangs in the balance. We must act decisively, collectively, and urgently. Therefore, I would, as this report says, we must look at actively interceding and protecting and investing in new pipelines into the industry via education, apprenticeships, as well as some of the more traditional routes through drama schools and arts administration courses. Because on stage work is visible, the backstage and administration is not, and we risk not getting the right skills into these areas. And often people don't know what type of work is available within the sector. And we must ensure that diverse voices are heard and represented at every level. Addressing these skills gaps requires a concerted effort from government, industry, stakeholders, and the wider communities. Investing in targeted support programs to provide training and upskilling opportunities for individuals within the culture sector, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. This includes initiatives to improve digital literacy, promote diversity and inclusion, and support the transition to new ways of working in a post-pandemic world. Furthermore, we must ensure that financial support is available to sustain cultural organisations and professionals through these challenging times, allowing them to weather the storm and emerge stronger on the other side. And this has to include funding for arts and culture initiatives, grants for freelancers and small businesses, and incentives to encourage private sector investment into the creative industries. In summary, the skills gap that have emerged in the cultural sector as a result of COVID-19 represents a significant challenge that must be addressed with urgency and resolve. And I hope by working together to support and empower individuals and organisations within the sector, we can ensure that our cultural heritage remains vibrant and recovers after this unprecedented time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll go straight into our fourth recommendation, which is around ensuring digital access. It's prompted by the sector's pivot to digital during the pandemic, but also the evidence I mentioned earlier of this widespread snapback to in-person performance. It aims to support greater sector and community resilience in the event of a future crisis. So we suggest that DCMS's sector creative vision, published last year, be revisited in light of changing attitudes, behaviours, and new understandings gained during the pandemic about both the role of digital for accessibility and for organisational resilience, but also the importance of live in-person performance for well-being and connection. So the government should really consider the role and needs of cultural organisations, cultural workers and their audiences as part of its strategic upgrading of digital infrastructure, especially in rural areas. And it should harmonise approaches to digital rights and intellectual property, while organisations need to ensure that these rights are then formalised in employment structures. We furthermore suggest that we can learn lessons from Germany, where, as we'll hear shortly, the role of resilience manager is helping organisations with their holistic transformation processes. And within England, we think that a body such as the Digital Culture Network could offer such a function for smaller organisations that don't have the resources to do this on their own. Finally, we think that arts funders should resource organisations to build accessibility into digital activity as a default and include minoritised creatives in the development of digital inclusivity and accessibility in the way we've seen happen in Canada. The pandemic taught us that digital really was a means of including previously excluded spectators and of building and rejuvenating audience populations. And as we return to in-person performances, it's crucial that these accessibility gains be retained. So I'll now pass you on to my colleague, Professor Kelsey Jacobson in Toronto, who is going to tell us some more about the Canadian approach to digital accessibility. Over to you.
Thank you, Pascal. In Canada, like elsewhere, the move to digital revealed challenges and opportunities for the live performing arts. While Canadian productions had to compete in the larger English language market with more established entities like the UK's National Theatre or the US's Met Opera, digital offerings also allowed for unprecedented access for audiences to experience and arts workers to collaborate and share work widely. This resulted in a larger focus on and conversations around accessibility in theatre and performance. Disabled artists specifically were ideally positioned to offer expertise, having already been accustomed to working in and with technology, in non-traditional working models, and having adept ability to respond to limitations or challenges with innovative solutions, responding to the needs in the room, as it were. Journalist Carly Maga profiled several disabled artists who articulated how their experiences working with Zoom and other applications set them up very well in terms of the hard tech skills, but also how the reality of uncertainty when working with folks who might have different or unpredictable access needs, like for instance, in relation to a chronic illness flare-up, facilitates a natural ethos of adaptability that allows for the accommodation of different working styles and paces, multiple modalities and forms, and feeds creative innovations in everything from design to contracting. The pandemic demonstrated the value and importance of this kind of knowledge, skill set, and creative work approach, prompting further reflection on theatre and the powerful possibilities afforded by this kind of access work, expertise, and accessible approaches. I will leave it there to hand over to our German colleague, Ronja Koch of Goethe University Frankfurt, who will describe the role so-called resilience managers are playing in supporting digital work in some German theatres. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. As for many theatres, the pandemic in Germany has highlighted the gaps in the digitalization process in terms of artistic work, but above all in terms of internal structures. In order to drive this process forward, the Digital Transformation Department at the Staatstheater Hannover, which was previously headed by just one person, was expanded to include several employees. Among other things, the department was responsible for implementing a cloud tool that was accessible to everyone. Before the pandemic, only 1/3 of the backstage worker had access to the theater's digital structures. In Hannover, the Works Council and the new Digital Transformation Department also asked themselves questions about mobile working, and they set up an internal survey to find out how they can enable hybrid working in the future. So the department and their role as resilience manager really encompass everything concerning digitalization, and it's still a work in progress. Another good practice example is the Staatstheater Augsburg. In fall 2020, they hired with Tina Lorenz a new project manager for digital development, with whom we also spoke. She looks at it on different levels. Firstly, in terms of digital formats and how can digital audience be reached, and then, of course, regarding administration and in-house planning. This resulted in project with 360-degree videos instead of frontally filmed performances, hybrid formats between analog and digital, or the opening of a Discord server. Another special feature was, and still is, the offer to have VR glasses delivered to your home and thus experience VR theater at home. The state theaters in Augsburg and Hanover show what is possible and necessary. The digitalization process had already begun in each case prior to the pandemic, but was accelerated by it. This would not have been possible without the investment and new recruitment by the theaters. These structures have been built up sustainably so that new digital paths can continue to be taken even after the pandemic. It became clear that it is not enough for the communication department to suddenly be responsible for everything digital, and that someone with the right expertise is needed for this, which can be fulfilled by a resilience manager. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronja. We are going to move on now to our final recommendation, which is around building a case for the live performing arts that centres its potential for transformative social good while continuing to recognise its contribution to the economy. Action on this should, we think, provide a base for economic investment, for strengthening the evidence for community or health and wellbeing activity, and for developing networks that can support organisations, places, and people. Our research showed how responses to crisis in countries across the G7 were shaped by attitudes towards the value of culture. They reflected differing understandings of the role of performing arts in influencing well-being, social integration, sense of place, participation in democracy, topics such as that. In Canada and Germany, as we've heard, the pandemic appeared to accelerate attempts to enshrine the arts and protections for artists in legislation. In France, the long-standing policy of cultural exception also served to protect the creative workforce somewhat. In Japan and the USA, debates around cultural value were less prominent during the pandemic. When they did arise, their focus was often on areas such as national identity or urban regeneration. We're calling on research funders in the UK to urgently prioritise study of the impact of localised differences in funding of arts and cultural provision against some really key social and economic markers. Arts funders need to ensure that subsidised organisations can fulfil their artistic missions with additional funding, if appropriate, earmarked for other kinds of activity. For organisations, purposeful long-term partnerships outside the sector were a real source of strength during the pandemic, but these need careful fostering. And local authorities are well placed, if they're properly funded, to implement cultural strategies that, among other things, can support and sustain such partnerships. And finally, we would like to see consistent government messaging around creative occupations and the performing arts that promotes and reflects an understanding of cultural value beyond the economic. In the UK research for this report, we noted several examples from the devolved regions where a diverse understanding of the value of culture supported resilience in the sector locally, including in Sheffield. And I'm delighted then that we're first able to hear from Professor Vanessa Toulmin, who was PI of one of the AHRC-funded COVID response research projects and is currently the Director of City and Culture at Sheffield University. Vanessa.
Thank you. Thank you for this. And I want to start with the term hyperlocal, because in many ways what we have in Sheffield is probably the largest hyperlocal population of any city in the UK. And even though our work extended across South Yorkshire, very much the evidence we drew was from Sheffield. Sheffield is on a different journey from a lot of local authorities in that Sheffield more or less abstained from investing in its culture about 11 years ago. And ironically, the pandemic and the work that we did with the university and our partners actually showed for the first time in many ways the really important value of culture and partnerships. So the culture organisations in Sheffield have been in strong partnerships over the last 10 years because of this absence or abstainment from the council. We had a great relationships with businesses. So it really, of all the recommendations, I think it's really important to also note the importance of the business community. And in Sheffield, the business community became one of our greatest allies in demonstrating the economic and social and health-being value of our information. What happened in Sheffield was the Business Recovery Group, the formation of the Sheffield Collective, a cultural compact with the Arts Council, but also real-time data delivered. That's all in the report, which I will put in the link, which you can see. I'll add that in the link in a minute. But what came out of that and what has been incredibly valuable over the last 14 months has been the formation of the Sheffield Cultural Strategy. And that is a partnership between the university, the Arts Council, and the council. Each of those organisations invested a substantial amount of money in creating a cultural strategy and allowing and enabling that cultural strategy for the people, by the people of Sheffield and the creatives. Our work had showed different areas of strength: freelancers in Sheffield, small SMEs, micro SMEs, and I use the business language because I think it's important to also think of the fact that culture is a business that lost 60% of its GVA during the pandemic alone in Sheffield and South Yorkshire. We needed those recovery routes. And the three of the things that came out of this, first of all, was a cultural strategy. Secondly, there was a cultural pipeline fund, which is now going to be, has just been launched. And thirdly was an undertaking and commitment from the business communities through the Sheffield Property Association, the Sheffield Compact and the Chambers of a percentage of support for any new MPOs or existing MPOs that achieved that through the Arts Council funding. So there was practical answers, practical partnerships, which were as a result of previous austerity for the council. Now, I'm very pleased to say the council, the partnerships that we have in Sheffield are actually seeing green shoots of investment from the council, from the local authority, and this is matched by support from the Arts Council. So the pandemic made the council realise that culture was an important gel that brought Sheffield together. It also enabled the business companies, to help and support it, but also gave us a different way of looking, that we were acting in some ways as gatekeepers, and what we needed to do was open the gates, allow the kingdom to be taken by various groups, and also enable the role of the creative ecology, the wider amazing creative ecology of Sheffield. So our results were very hyperlocal, a hyperlocal of 750,000 people, but it enabled a new belief in the culture and a belief that the local authorities and the organisations were working together for the good of the city, which will result in quite incredibly buoyant and vibrancy. So finally, what was the important aspect of the university's role in this? That cultural vibrancy is one of the major pillars of our innovation policy, that without a culturally vibrant city, we'll not attract students, we will not retain staff, and we'll not have an enriched residence to be part of. So having that work done by my colleagues, and there was many colleagues who worked on this project, at least 7 across 3 different faculties and departments, and a wider range of more colleagues who are working on how we interact with the culture vibrancy of Sheffield. It's important to understand that only through partnerships at a hyperlocal level can we actually really make a difference to the cultural vibrancy and strategy moving forward.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Our next and final in this section speaker is Janet Tam from Something to Aim For.
Hello, thank you, Karen. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. My name is Janet Tam, the Executive Director and Joint CEO of Something to Aim For, STAFF. STAFF is a creative structure support organization committed to bringing about change by authentically reflecting marginalized and underrepresented artists and people, particularly by reason of disability, ill health, or social or economic disadvantage within the mainstream UK culture.
We envision a world in which all people have meaningful connections to cultural experiences, and we believe a diverse and inclusive cultural ecology benefits all. The word for crisis in Chinese, 危機, is comprised of two characters. The first one, 危, it means danger. The second one, 機, it represents opportunity. This duality encapsulates the journey of staff and the artists we work with during the pandemic. The pandemic brought unprecedented challenges, especially to the artists and communities we champion at staff, in ways not only echoing the findings of this research, but the fact that the artists we work with were the ones who bear the burn by the pandemic the most. Many faced severe setbacks as their platforms to showcase art vanished with lockdowns. The struggle for survival became real, leading to dropouts and deepened disparities. These hardships hit hardest those on the fringes of society, amplifying existing inequalities. Yet, facing these adversities, we also encountered unique opportunities for growth and transformation. Staff, though a small organization, was not spared from the pandemic's impact. We quickly realized the need to adapt and rethink our approach. One notable pivot was the creation of Staff Life, a digital space launched in June 2020. This platform was born out of necessity to support the platformed artists during the lockdowns, fostering a safe and accessible environment for experimentation, co-creation, and cultural exchange. This initiative represents just one of the ways we've responded to the crisis, ensuring that creativity and cultural engagement continue to flourish. As we navigate the re-emerging performing arts sector, we find ourselves at a critical juncture. The pandemic served as a global rehearsal, a test for our resilience, creativity, and adaptability. What lessons have we learned, particularly within the cultural sector? As reflected by this research project, we've seen firsthand the vulnerabilities within our cultural ecosystems, but also the potential pathways to resilience and equity. The crisis has underscored the importance of building a more inclusive cultural sector, one that acknowledges marginalized voices, ensures equal access to platforms, and recognizes cultural engagement as a fundamental right. Our experiences underscore the belief that meaningful engagement with culture is not a privilege, but a right for all. Embracing cultural diversity fosters social harmony and cohesion, enriching society as a whole. I'm particularly inspired by countries like Germany and Canada, which are pioneering efforts to protect artists and cultural workers through legislation and policy. These examples light the way for what we can achieve globally. I believe that the capability to cultivate change and a more equitable cultural landscape is in the hands of each and every one of us. No matter our roles, we each have the power to act as catalysts for change, creating a cultural ecosystem that is more resilient, inclusive, and ready to adapt to future challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Really hopeful, powerful words. And I love, as I said in the chat, I love the idea of combining danger and opportunity as a way of thinking forward to future crises. Whilst people formulate ideas for questions, and please do put them in the chat or preferably in the Q&A, don't forget the opportunity and don't lose the opportunity to feedback to us through just a really short 2-question evaluation. And you can follow the link either in the chat or the QR code on the screen. So moving on, Marina has been collating any questions that are already there. Marina, do we have anything you want to highlight?
Yes. So I thought we could start with a question from Andrew Hurst. How can we progress sector ecosystem mapping in the UK? Would love to support this, but who might be appropriate research partners and funders for this?
Thank you, Andrew. Is anyone in any of our international research colleagues, or indeed any of the panel here, would like to take that on? Potentially, Lisa?
Thanks. I've got part of an answer to that question. So at Society of London Theatre and UK Theatre, I'll just turn my video on so you can see me. There we go. We're really interested in the concept of ecosystem. We can't advocate on behalf of the sector if we don't talk about ecosystem, and one part of the sector is intrinsically weaker if another part of the ecosystem starts to fail or die. So we heard Carolyn talk about touring, for example. That's something that's not come back with force after the pandemic, and we would say that the ecosystem is weaker without a good touring model. So one of the things that we want to do as a trade association, but we need to commission the work out to do it because we don't have the skills in-house, is to map the financing model of the sector so we understand its vulnerabilities and we can work towards developing a sustainable financing model and articulate the fiscal and policy environment and fiscal incentives that we might ask government to put in place in order to support that sustainable financing model. Now, that's from the lens of a financing model. I've said that a couple of times. There's other lenses that you would want to see the ecosystem through. I was asked to speak about skills, and one of the weaknesses that we have in our sector is not to really understand the workforce that's in our sector. So that's kind of another lens that you'd want to see the ecosystem through. But I just wanted to share that was one of the things that we have on the books to think about and to do on behalf of our sector. But that's just one lens of an ecosystem, and we would love to have conversations with others that we might want to explore other parts of the ecosystem and how we might join up with that work.
Thank you, Lisa. I noticed that Vanessa's just put something in the chat about a mapping exercise in Barnsley. Did you want to say anything about that, Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we find is that, again, at the hyperlocal, you don't get the detail that national surveys do, because they don't really go down to the level that a local authority or parish council, local council needs to understand. So I think in a way, as alongside national, we need a lot more local mapping, regional mapping, because that ecosystem is often quite 15, 20 miles away. So touring is very important, but we found our freelancers in Sheffield City region, South Yorkshire, they all had 2 or 3 jobs. They worked in the theatre, they worked in outdoors, they worked in the music. So, and I'm an entertainment historian, so often it's seasonal, it's weekly, it's hourly, it's nightly. So you found that 5 or 6 industries were impacted by one freelancer. And I think that is not picked up by Nesta surveys, by Arts Council surveys, and that's only picked up at the hyperlocal level.
Thank you, Vanessa. I hope that answers some of your questions. I think some of the other information might be in the German example. Potentially there is some information in the report as to who the partners in the Hess example were. Marina, do we have a...
Yeah, so our second question is, what was the representation of disabled people like in the research, and how is this represented across the recommendations? And also, how do diverse-led organizations fare across the research, and what does it look like on the other side of COVID-19 for an increase in the diversity?
Great question. Pascal, do you want to tell us a little bit about how we...
Yes. So for the research side of the question, we were very aware that because we had to rely on existing networks and people who had started to do that sort of work within academia, we were selecting people who were not necessarily as diverse as we would have liked. So we tried to compensate for that through the involvement of our lived experience panel of creative practitioners, whom we recruited with a view to diversity and to bringing in a whole sort of different range of viewpoints and correctives. We also took on board our partner, and you heard Janet Tam there, of Something to Aim For, a diversity organisation, an organisation that is particularly interested in representing marginalised voices, including and especially the voices of disabled practitioners and artists. So we had that very much at the forefront of our minds, and questions about the needs of a widely understood workforce were part of our research questions as a result, and drove the entire research all the way through. Now, as for how diverse-led organisations fare across the research and on the other side of COVID, as we tried to explain, there is a sense that all pre-existing disadvantages were exacerbated by the pandemic. So that there was a sense that those organisations had a more difficult time coming out of the pandemic, certainly in the UK. I don't know whether we can hear perhaps something from the USA and Canada about how that played out in those countries.
Sure, I can say a word about that. I mean, I think there was definitely the same sense that artists of color were more vulnerable, that they were often already in more precarious positions. I think that the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent call for racial justice in the US did have an effect in that many foundations, sort of private funders of the arts, which occupy such a crucial role in the US ecosystem, made an explicit commitment to funding minority-led organizations. And so that there was a sense that moving away from perhaps larger regional theaters that had always been funded, and really foregrounding funding smaller minority-led companies, emerging companies, individual artists. And that I think there's, it's not clear how sustained that change will be, but it has certainly been something that has been noticed in the sector over the past few years.
Thank you, Barbara. Carolyn, I think you have something to add.
I would say that in the UK, there was definitely a willingness and shift from the funders to have conversations that they hadn't had before about historical underfunding of what I'd call organizations that work with marginalized communities. And I think there has been the beginnings of a redress of that balance and the preparedness of funders to consider how they equate risk with smaller organizations, and trying to interrogate that, because often there are biases that come into play. And what I mean by that is often organizations that work within specialized communities are smaller, have less staff, may not all be full-time, maybe part-time, maybe freelancers, and our ability to be able to do loads of paperwork is reduced. So things that were useful, like the cultural relief funding, for example, had kind of guidance on it that basically smaller organizations wouldn't have been able to apply for that funding. And someone's already pointed out in the chat that individuals weren't able to apply for that funding. So I definitely think there's a shift, but I would echo the sentiments before. Whether that shift is permanent is a question. And we are operating in a period of scarcity of people, scarcity of resource, scarcity of financial. And the risk always is with that is that you revert to the status quo. And we have to resist that. We have to actively resist going back to the status quo. Otherwise, we risk ending up with a sector that's less vibrant, less diverse, less representative of the communities that we all work within the UK. And it's going to be tough, but I think within all of this challenge, there's opportunities to find new ways to work together and collaborate. Partnership working is massively important. It's definitely part of what Tala was doing to kind of ensure our continued existence in terms of this scarcity model, is partnering with people and sharing resources, which we're doing in a hyper-local way, which we've been doing as part of London Borough of Culture within Croydon. We're working together with cultural institutions and other stakeholders like the council, like the creative enterprise zone, with whoever wants to work with us, who understands the value of culture and how it intersects with all of these different, whether it's public health or mental health or whatever it is. There was absolutely an intrinsic value to culture that we discovered again in the pandemic when we were all locked in our houses, and that was the only way that we could kind of express ourselves or experience the world was through that cultural lens. So yeah, that would be my my warning and my friendly advice, is not to slip back into the status quo.
Thank you, Carolyn. And I think, as your earlier contribution suggested, and as we saw in the research, there's also a considerable amount of emotional labour, and there was a considerable amount of emotional labour involved in kind of putting that pressure against the status quo returning. So thank you for the work you're doing currently. Marina, do we have further questions?
Yes, so the next question we might have touched on a little bit already, but Dana and Ricky in the chat say, we have reviewed over 500 digital productions all over the world since the pandemic. And until the 2023-2024 season, we noticed most of these shows were created by small groups of 3 to 5 artists on a very small budget. How do we make sure those small groups are invested in across the sector? And then they follow up by saying, what are actionable steps that theatre companies comprised of artists working alone or in a small group can do today to be more resilient in their programming for the coming seasons?
Thank you for those questions, Dana and Ricky. Do we have anyone from the panel who would like to come in on that question? Anyone from or potentially from our lived experience panel members? Or Barbara, are you able to speak to any examples from the United States? There were some kind of innovative models that are growing in that are arising in the States.
Yeah, sorry, I think this is the ongoing challenge. I think what we saw, these are, I think, very local and very specific. So, you know, it's always difficult to think about how far they might be generalizable, but we were seeing models for everything from like producing organization, actually renting space or securing space, and then offering various ways for very small companies or individual artists to apply for a slot in, you know, say a festival, to slightly more established companies. This was the Detroit Public Theater example, which as soon as they secured some space, the next thing they did was offer residencies to much smaller companies in their same city. And those models were really inspiring. Some of it, I think, again, comes back to how generalizable are they? How much do they depend on very specific circumstances? And relating back to the discussions about how we share best models and best practices, right? Who knows about these models, which is, I think, another key concern.
Thank you, Barbara. I failed to notice that Carolyn had a hand up. I think, do you, Carolyn, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just, if this is useful, I think it is very precarious for freelancers at the moment, and I think a way that may be useful is actually freelancers banding together, working together as collectives. And there are kind of various things like Make Freelancers Work, various networks, which is about supporting artists, which I would absolutely 100% recommend. Like, this is obviously very UK context-based when I'm saying about Make Freelancers Work. But in general, artists coming together and sharing resources, sharing expertise together might be a way forward that I would suggest. And certainly I know quite a few artists that are coming together as collectives as a way of doing that. And I just thought that might be something useful to say.
Perfect. Thank you, Carolyn. I think we probably have a few more questions, but we are running out of time. So I want to thank everyone who's spoken so far, everybody on our panel, everybody who's asked questions. Thank you for that. And we are going to hand over to Marisha Sushitz, who is representing the British Academy, who are our funders for this research, just to give us some wrap-up comments and to talk about the programme which funded the work.
Hi everyone, well, thank you for such an interesting webinar and launch of a report. Just to maybe give a bit of an overview on the British Academy, we are one of the UK's national academies, and we focus on the social sciences and humanities. We are a grant provider. We also have a fellowship of experts in the disciplines of social sciences and humanities. And some of the work that we do that maybe isn't always visible is policy engagement and policy impact. And bringing that together with sort of that grant provider responsibility that we have, basically want to bring expertise of academics and their research into timely and important policy development and discussions. And the pandemic preparedness programme was actually part of a follow-up call following two previous grants that we ran, one on COVID-19 recovery in the G7 and a programme on UK-USA vaccine hesitancy. And with the pandemic preparedness call, we basically wanted to focus on that element of preparedness and what lessons could be learned from COVID-19 across the G7, noting the critical role of social sciences and humanities research in achieving a holistic response to resilience and preparedness. Through this call, we really wanted, we really aimed to bring forward the key issues and support ongoing research in this area. And within this call, we had a whole range of successful applications working on various areas. So in this case, it was looking at the live performing arts sector. We have another group of academics also looking at the role of IP licensing, others looking at more at local community level organisations and so forth. So really looking at a broad range of how we can build resilience and preparedness. And I think we also wanted to really focus on that international element of what can we learn from other countries, from other approaches, and to really build up not only sort of a national resilience, but a global resilience. And this particular project, which we've been really happy to fund, really glad to sort of see the fruits of all that hard work, has come from a really interesting and crucial area. The careful research and findings of this report offers a really valuable recommendations for the live performing arts sector, one which many of us gain great joy from, and yet which often can be the first to fall onto the wayside when there's either a crisis or a look at priorities. And yet, as highlighted through many of the speakers today, is very crucial and important, and one which we all turn to in those moments of uncertainty. And we hope that this report can highlight just how this sector can be supported and made more resilient, thus allowing it to remain strong, stable and flourishing, even in uncertain situations such as any future pandemics, which unfortunately we've got to be prepared for. And so I would just like to finish with a huge congratulations to all of the team and the researchers who've been involved in this, to Pascal and Karen, but I know that there's a whole body of people behind the amazing work that's been done. Congratulations and thank you for bringing together this vital research and report, and we look forward to see where this goes forward, and we really hope that the key policymakers do look at it and take it forward, and see where they can really support a sector which can be thriving so much more, but also speaks to so many different areas, to so many different marginalized voices, and to various communities. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Marisia. Thank you, everyone, for contributing today. That's the end of our report launch. We hope you will go and have a look at the reports. We will send you a link with the British Academy summary report and also the longer report, and we look forward to being in touch with you soon. Thank you. Bye.